Sarah Martinez wiped the grease from her hands with a worn rag as she looked up at the massive cargo ship engine that towered above her. The engine room of the MV Atlantic Star was filled with the usual hum of machinery, but today something was different. The main engine, a colossal piece of engineering that powered the 300-meter vessel, had been making strange noises for weeks. The ship's captain, James Morrison, had called every port they visited, trying to find someone who could diagnose the problem. 3 different marine engineers had examined the engine, and all had come to the same conclusion. The engine was beyond repair. The damage was too extensive, they said. The ship would need to be taken to a major shipyard for a complete engine replacement, which would cost millions of dollars and take months to complete. Sarah had been working as a junior mechanic on cargo ships for only 2 years. At 26, she was already considered experienced by some standards. But she knew that most of the crew still saw her as the young woman who was lucky to have gotten the job. Her father had been a mechanic, and she had learned everything she could from him before he passed away when she was 22. Since then, she had worked twice as hard as anyone else to prove herself in a field dominated by men. The engine problem started 3 weeks ago when they were halfway between Rotterdam and New York. At first, it was just a slight vibration that most people wouldn't even notice. Sarah felt it, though. She had developed a sensitivity to the ship's rhythms during her time aboard, and she could tell when something wasn't right. She mentioned it to her supervisor, Frank Rodriguez, but he dismissed her concerns. "Every engine makes noise, Sarah," Frank had said. "These old ships aren't supposed to run silent. You worry too much." But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. She started spending her free time in the engine room, listening to the sounds the massive machine made. She began to notice patterns in the vibrations, changes in the pitch of certain components. She started keeping a notebook, writing down her observations, drawing diagrams of what she thought might be happening inside the engine. The other mechanics found her behavior strange. During their breaks, while they played cards or watched movies, Sarah would be down in the engine room with her flashlight and tools, examining every bolt, every pipe, every connection. Some of them joked that she was obsessed, but Sarah didn't care. Something inside her knew that this engine was trying to tell her something important. When the first marine engineer came aboard in New York, Sarah tried to share her observations with him. She showed him her notebook, pointed out the specific sounds she had been tracking, and explained her theory about what might be causing the problem. The engineer, a man in his 50s with decades of experience, barely glanced at her notes. "Little lady," he said with a patronizing smile, "I've been working on ship engines since before you were born. I think I can handle this without help from the cleaning crew." Sarah felt her face burn with embarrassment and anger, but she said nothing. She watched as the engineer spent 3 hours examining the engine, running standard diagnostic tests and checking all the obvious components. When he finished, he declared that the engine had suffered catastrophic internal damage and would need to be completely replaced. The second engineer, who came aboard when they reached Boston, was slightly more polite but equally dismissive. He looked at Sarah's notebook when she offered it, nodded politely, and then proceeded to conduct his own examination. His conclusion was the same: complete engine failure, replacement needed. By the time they reached their third port in Charleston, the engine problems had gotten worse. The vibrations were now noticeable to everyone on board, and strange grinding noises echoed through the ship at random intervals. The crew was getting nervous, and Captain Morrison was under pressure from the shipping company to find a solution quickly. The third marine engineer was younger than the first 2, probably in his 30s, and Sarah hoped he might be more open to her input. She waited until he had finished his preliminary examination before approaching him. She explained that she had been monitoring the engine problems from the beginning and had developed some theories about the root cause. The engineer listened politely, but Sarah could see in his eyes that he was just being courteous. When she finished explaining, he thanked her for her observations and said he would take them into consideration. But like the others, he spent his time running standard diagnostics and checking conventional components. His conclusion was identical to the previous 2. The engine was beyond repair. That night, as the ship prepared to leave Charleston, Sarah sat in her small cabin staring at her notebook. She had filled nearly 50 pages with observations, sketches, and theories. She had documented every sound, every vibration, every change in the engine's behavior over the past 3 weeks. She was absolutely convinced that she understood what was wrong with the engine, but no one would listen to her. Frank Rodriguez knocked on her cabin door around 10 o'clock. When Sarah opened it, she could see the stress on his face. The shipping company had given Captain Morrison an ultimatum: find a solution by the time they reached Savannah, or the ship would be taken out of service for months while the engine was replaced. "Sarah," Frank said, his voice tired, "I know you've been spending a lot of time studying this engine problem. The captain is getting desperate. If you really think you know what's wrong, maybe it's time to speak up." Sarah looked at her supervisor, surprised by his change in attitude. For weeks he had been dismissive of her concerns, and now he was asking for her help. "The three engineers all agreed that the engine can't be fixed," Sarah said carefully. "Why would you think I might know something they don't?" Frank sighed and leaned against the doorframe. "Because you've been living with this engine every day for 3 weeks. You've heard every sound it makes, felt every vibration. Those engineers, they come on board, run their tests, and leave. They don't really know this engine like you do." Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and terror. This was her chance to prove herself, but it was also an enormous risk. If she was wrong, if she tried to fix the engine and made things worse, it could end her career before it really began. But if she was right, if she could solve a problem that 3 experienced engineers couldn't, it would change everything. The next morning, Sarah stood before Captain Morrison in his quarters, her notebook clutched tightly in her hands. The captain was a stern man in his early 50s, with graying hair and tired eyes that had seen too many problems at sea. Frank Rodriguez stood beside her, offering moral support, but Sarah knew this moment would define her future in the maritime industry. "Captain," Sarah began, her voice steadier than she felt, "I believe I know what's wrong with the engine, and I think I can fix it." Captain Morrison raised an eyebrow. 3 certified marine engineers have told me this engine is beyond repair. They all have decades of experience. "You're telling me they're all wrong?" Sarah opened her notebook and spread her detailed diagrams across the captain's desk. "Sir, I've been monitoring this engine since the problem started. The engineers only spent a few hours examining it. They ran standard diagnostics, but they didn't look at the patterns I've been tracking. The captain studied her drawings, which showed detailed cross-sections of the engine components, with notes about vibration frequencies, temperature variations, and timing sequences. Sarah's handwriting was neat and precise, and her diagrams were surprisingly professional. "The engineers all concluded that we have catastrophic bearing failure in the main crankshaft," Sarah continued. "But I don't think that's the primary problem. I think it's a secondary effect caused by something else entirely." Captain Morrison looked up from the notebook. "Go on." "The vibration patterns I've recorded don't match bearing failure," Sarah explained. "Bearing failure creates a consistent rhythmic knocking that increases with engine speed. What we're experiencing is irregular, and it doesn't correlate directly with RPMs. The grinding noises happen at random intervals, not in sync with the crankshaft rotation." Frank Rodriguez watched nervously as Sarah continued her explanation. He had worked with her for 2 years and knew she was incredibly thorough, but he also knew the enormous risk they were taking by challenging the expert's diagnosis. "I believe the problem is in the fuel injection system," Sarah said, pointing to a specific section of her diagram. "Specifically, I think we have a faulty fuel injection pump that's creating uneven fuel delivery to the cylinders. This causes irregular combustion, which creates the random vibrations and grinding noises. Over time, the irregular combustion has put stress on the bearings, making them loose, but they're not actually damaged beyond repair." Captain Morrison was silent for a long moment, studying Sarah's notes. The shipping company had already made arrangements to have the ship towed to a major shipyard if no solution was found by the time they reached Savannah. The cost would be enormous, and the ship would be out of service for months. "The engineers tested the fuel injection system," the captain said finally. "They said it was functioning normally." "They tested it using standard pressure tests and visual inspections," Sarah replied. "But the problem I'm describing would only be visible under load during actual operation. The fuel injection pump might pass static tests but fail under the dynamic conditions of real engine operation." Sarah flipped to another page in her notebook, showing a detailed timeline of when the problems occurred. "Look at this pattern, sir. The problems are worst during heavy load conditions when we're fighting strong currents or headwinds. During light load periods, the symptoms almost disappear. That's consistent with a fuel delivery problem. not bearing failure. The captain was impressed by the thoroughness of Sarah's documentation, but he was also acutely aware of the risks involved. If he allowed a junior mechanic to attempt a repair that 3 certified engineers had declared impossible, and if something went wrong, it could be a career-ending decision for everyone involved. Sarah, Captain Morrison said carefully, even if you're right about the diagnosis, do you have the skills and tools necessary to repair a fuel injection pump on a ship this size? We're talking about incredibly precise work that usually requires specialized equipment. Sarah had been preparing for this question. Sir, I've studied the technical manuals for this engine model extensively. The fuel injection pump on this ship is a Bosch M-series pump, which is actually a design that's been in use for decades. The repair procedures are well documented, and we have most of the tools needed in our machine shop. The parts we don't have can be fabricated using the ship's lathe and mill. Frank Rodriguez couldn't hide his surprise. He knew Sarah was dedicated, but he hadn't realized she had studied the technical documentation so thoroughly. The Bosch M-series pump was indeed a proven design, but it was also incredibly complex, with tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. The biggest challenge, Sarah continued, will be calibrating the pump after repair. That normally requires specialized test equipment that we don't have on board, but I think I can work around that by using the engine itself as a test platform, making incremental adjustments while monitoring the engine's performance. Captain Morrison walked to his window and looked out at the ocean. They were still 12 hours out from Savannah, which gave them a narrow window of time to attempt a repair. If Sarah was wrong, or if the repair attempt caused additional damage, they would still have time to reach port and arrange for the ship to be towed to a shipyard. What do you need from me? The captain asked, turning back to Sarah. I need permission to shut down the main engine for approximately 8 hours, Sarah said. I also need Frank to assist me, and I need access to the machine shop to fabricate a couple of specialized tools. The captain considered the request. Shutting down the main engine would mean operating on auxiliary power, which would slow their progress significantly. But if Sarah was right, it could save the company millions of dollars and months of downtime. Frank, Captain Morrison said, what's your assessment of Sarah's theory? Frank Rodriguez had been dreading this question. He knew that supporting Sarah's plan could jeopardize his own career if things went wrong. But he also knew that Sarah had demonstrated remarkable technical insight during her time aboard the ship. Captain, Frank said slowly, I've worked with Sarah for 2 years, and I've never seen anyone more dedicated to understanding how machinery works. Her documentation is more thorough than anything I've seen from the certified engineers who examined this engine. I think her theory deserves a chance. Captain Morrison nodded. All right, Sarah. You have 8 hours to prove your theory, but I want you to understand the stakes involved. If you're wrong, if you cause additional damage to this engine, it could end your career. Are you prepared to accept that responsibility? Sarah looked directly into the captain's eyes. Yes, sir. I am. Then get started, the captain said. And Sarah? Good luck. As Sarah left the captain's quarters with Frank, her heart was pounding with a mixture of excitement and terror. She had just convinced the captain to let her attempt a repair that 3 experienced engineers had declared impossible. Everything she had learned about engines, everything she believed about her own abilities, was about to be put to the ultimate test. The engine room fell silent as Sarah shut down the massive main engine. The sudden absence of the familiar rumble that had been the ship's heartbeat for weeks felt eerie to everyone aboard. Word had spread quickly through the crew that the junior mechanic was attempting a repair that the experts had said was impossible, and opinions were divided between skepticism and hope. Sarah had spent the previous 2 hours preparing for this moment. She had gathered every tool she thought she might need and had fabricated 2 specialized wrenches using the ship's machine shop. Her notebook was open to a detailed, step-by-step procedure she had written based on the technical manual and her own analysis of the problem. Frank Rodriguez watched nervously as Sarah began removing the access panels to reach the fuel injection pump. The pump was located deep within the engine, surrounded by a maze of pipes, cables, and other components. Just reaching it would require removing dozens of parts, each of which would need to be carefully reinstalled in exactly the right position. Are you sure about this, Sarah? Frank asked as she began disconnecting fuel lines. Once we start taking this pump apart, there's no going back. Sarah paused for a moment, her wrench in hand. She thought about the 3 engineers who had examined this engine, all of whom had decades more experience than she did. She thought about Captain Morrison's warning that her career could be over if she was wrong. But she also thought about all the hours she had spent listening to this engine, feeling its vibrations, documenting its behavior. "I'm sure, Frank," she said, continuing to work. "The patterns I've recorded don't lie. This engine is telling us exactly what's wrong with it. We just have to listen." The fuel injection pump was a marvel of precision engineering, containing dozens of moving parts that worked together to deliver exactly the right amount of fuel to each cylinder at precisely the right moment. Sarah had studied the technical drawings for hours, memorizing the location of every component, but seeing the actual pump in person was still intimidating. As Sarah carefully removed the pump from the engine, she could see immediately that her theory was correct. The pump's housing showed signs of wear that the previous engineers had missed because they hadn't removed it from the engine. More importantly, when Sarah examined the pump's internal mechanism, she found exactly what she had suspected: a worn plunger that was causing erratic fuel delivery. "Frank, look at this," Sarah said, pointing to the worn component. "See how the plunger surface is scored? That's causing inconsistent fuel pressure, which creates the irregular combustion we've been experiencing." Frank examined the part under a magnifying glass and whistled softly. The wear was subtle, but it was definitely there. The scoring on the plunger surface would cause fuel pressure to vary unpredictably, exactly as Sarah had theorized. "How did the other engineers miss this?" Frank asked. "They didn't remove the pump from the engine," Sarah explained. "They only tested it in place using static pressure tests. This kind of wear only shows up when you can examine the actual components." The next challenge was repairing the damaged plunger. The part was machined to tolerances of a few thousandths of an inch, and any repair work would need to maintain those specifications. Sarah had studied the procedures for resurfacing fuel injection components, but she had never actually performed such delicate work. Using the ship's precision lathe, Sarah began the painstaking process of machining a new surface on the plunger. The work required incredible patience and skill, as even a tiny error could ruin the part completely. Frank assisted by monitoring the measurements and helping to set up the cutting tools. After 3 hours of careful work, Sarah had restored the plunger to its original specifications. But the repair was only half the job. The real test would be reassembling the pump and calibrating it to deliver fuel at exactly the right pressure and timing. Sarah consulted her notebook as she began reassembling the fuel injection pump. Every component had to be installed in precisely the right position, with exactly the right torque specifications. The work was incredibly detailed, requiring her to use special gauges to measure clearances and timing relationships. "Sarah," Frank said as she worked, "I have to ask you something. How do you know all this? I mean, I've been working on engines for 20 years, and I've never seen anyone with your level of technical knowledge who wasn't a certified engineer." Sarah continued working as she answered, "My father taught me that every machine has a language, Frank. If you listen carefully enough, it will tell you exactly what it needs. When I was growing up, he used to bring me to his shop every weekend. He would show me how to listen to engines, how to feel what they were trying to communicate through vibrations and sounds." She paused to check a measurement, then continued, "After he died, I kept studying. I read every technical manual I could find. I took correspondence courses in marine engineering. I figured that if I was going to work in this field, I needed to know everything I could possibly learn." Frank was impressed but also concerned. "Sarah, you do realize that you're essentially working as an engineer without the certification, right? If the maritime authorities ever found out—" "I know the risks, Frank," Sarah said quietly, "but I also know that this engine can be fixed. The engineers who examined it didn't look deep enough. They made assumptions based on the symptoms without investigating the root cause." As Sarah completed the pump reassembly, she faced the most challenging part of the repair: calibration. Under normal circumstances, this would be done using specialized test equipment that could simulate engine load conditions while measuring fuel delivery rates. But the ship didn't have such equipment, so Sarah would need to calibrate the pump by installing it in the engine and making adjustments based on the engine's actual performance. "This is the tricky part, Frank," Sarah said as she prepared to reinstall the pump. "I'm going to have to start the engine and make adjustments while it's running. It's not the safest way to do this, but it's our only option." Frank looked nervous. "Adjusting a fuel injection pump on a running engine? Sarah, that's incredibly dangerous. If you make the wrong adjustment, you could cause an explosion. Sarah nodded grimly. I know. That's why I've calculated the adjustment increments very carefully. I'll make tiny changes and monitor the engine's response. If anything seems wrong, I'll shut it down immediately. She had prepared detailed procedures for the calibration process, including specific RPM ranges for testing and exact measurement points for monitoring the engine's performance. She had also set up additional monitoring equipment to track vibrations, temperatures, and other parameters that would indicate whether her adjustments were working. As Sarah reinstalled the fuel injection pump, she felt the weight of everyone's expectations. The entire crew knew what she was attempting, and many of them had gathered in the engine room to watch. Some looked hopeful, others skeptical, but all of them understood that the next few hours would determine the ship's fate. Captain Morrison appeared in the engine room just as Sarah finished the installation. He looked tense but tried to appear confident for the benefit of the crew. How are we doing, Sarah? He asked. The pump is back in place, Captain, Sarah replied. Now comes the real test. I need to start the engine and calibrate the fuel delivery. It's going to take some time to get it right. The captain nodded. Take all the time you need. We're still several hours from Savannah. Sarah took a deep breath and reached for the engine start controls. Everything she had learned, everything she believed about her abilities was about to be put to the ultimate test. Sarah's hand trembled slightly as she reached for the engine start button. The engine room was packed with crew members who had come to witness what many believed would be either a miracle or a disaster. The silence was so complete that she could hear her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. Here we go, she whispered, and pressed the start button. The massive engine turned over slowly at first, then caught with a deep rumble that seemed to shake the entire ship. But something was wrong immediately. Instead of the smooth, powerful sound of a healthy engine, Sarah heard irregular firing from the cylinders, and the vibrations were worse than before. Shut it down, Frank shouted, but Sarah was already reaching for the emergency stop. The engine wound down with a series of coughing sounds that made everyone in the room wince. Captain Morrison stepped forward, his face grave. Sarah, what happened? Sarah was already consulting her notebook, comparing what she had just heard with her previous observations. The timing is off, she said, trying to keep the disappointment out of her voice. When I calibrated the pump, I started with the factory specifications, but this engine has been running for 15 years. The timing requirements have changed as the engine aged. Several crew members exchanged worried glances. This was exactly what they had feared would happen when a junior mechanic attempted repairs that certified engineers had declared impossible. But Sarah wasn't ready to give up. She had expected that the initial calibration might not be perfect. That's why she had prepared procedures for making incremental adjustments. Frank, help me adjust the pump timing, she said, moving to the fuel system controls. I need to advance the injection timing by about 2 degrees and see what happens. Frank looked nervous. Sarah, maybe we should call it off. The engine sounds worse now than it did before. No, Sarah said firmly. This is exactly what I expected might happen. Every engine is different, especially one that's been running for this many years. The factory specifications are just a starting point. I need to tune this pump specifically for this engine. She made a careful adjustment to the pump timing and prepared to start the engine again. This time, she would run it for only a few seconds to test the change. The second startup was better, but still not right. The irregular firing was less pronounced, but there was still an unsettling vibration that shouldn't have been there. Sarah made another small adjustment and tried again. By the fourth attempt, something remarkable happened. The engine started with a smooth, powerful rumble that was completely different from the labored sound it had been making for weeks. The irregular vibrations were gone, replaced by the steady, rhythmic pulse of a healthy engine. That's it, Sarah exclaimed, her face lighting up with excitement. Listen to that. That's what this engine is supposed to sound like. The crew members looked amazed. The difference was immediately obvious to everyone. The engine was running more smoothly than it had in months, with none of the grinding noises or irregular vibrations that had plagued it for weeks. But Captain Morrison remained cautious. It sounds good, Sarah, but we need to test it under load before we can be sure the repair is successful. Sarah nodded. You're absolutely right, Captain. The real test is whether it can perform under full power without the problems returning. She began gradually increasing the engine's power output, carefully monitoring every parameter. At quarter power, the engine performed flawlessly. At half power, it continued to run smoothly. When she pushed it to 3/4 power, there was a brief moment when everyone held their breath, but the engine continued to purr like a contented cat. "Full power test?" Sarah asked, looking at the captain. Captain Morrison nodded grimly. "Full power test." Sarah gradually pushed the engine to its maximum rated output. The sound was incredible, a deep, powerful rumble that spoke of enormous forces perfectly controlled. There were no irregular vibrations, no grinding noises, no signs of the problems that had plagued the engine for weeks. "Unbelievable," Frank whispered. "Sarah, you actually did it." The crew members began to cheer and applaud, but Sarah wasn't ready to celebrate yet. She needed to run the engine under various load conditions to make sure the repair would hold up under real-world operating conditions. For the next hour, Sarah put the engine through a complete series of performance tests. She varied the power output, changed the load conditions, and monitored every aspect of the engine's performance. Each test confirmed what she had hoped. The engine was not only fixed, but it was running better than it had in years. Captain Morrison watched the test results with growing amazement. The fuel consumption was down, the power output was up, and all the vibration measurements were within normal ranges. The engine was performing like new. "Sarah," the captain said, "I owe you an apology, and more than that, I owe you my respect. You've accomplished something that 3 certified engineers said was impossible." Sarah felt a wave of relief and satisfaction wash over her. All those hours of listening to the engine, all those pages of careful observations, all those nights spent studying technical manuals, it had all been worth it. But her celebration was interrupted when Frank pointed to one of the monitoring gauges. "Sarah, look at this. The oil pressure is higher than it was before the repair." Sarah examined the gauge readings and smiled. "That's exactly what should happen, Frank. The irregular combustion was causing excessive wear on the bearings, which reduced oil pressure. Now that the combustion is smooth and even, the bearings are sealing properly again and the oil pressure has returned to normal." This detail impressed Captain Morrison even more than the successful repair itself. It showed that Sarah hadn't just fixed the immediate problem. She had understood the complex interactions between different engine systems and had addressed the root cause of multiple symptoms. As the test period continued, other improvements became apparent. The engine's temperature was more stable, the exhaust emissions were cleaner, and the overall efficiency was significantly better. Sarah had not only saved the ship from months of expensive repairs, but she had actually improved its performance beyond what anyone had thought. Possible word of Sarah's success spread quickly through the maritime community via radio communications with other ships and port authorities. By the time they reached Savannah, there were already requests from other shipping companies asking if Sarah would be available to examine their problem engines. But for Sarah, the greatest satisfaction came from proving that careful observation and thorough analysis could overcome even the most challenging technical problems. She had listened to what the engine was trying to tell her, and she had found a solution that the experts had missed. As the MV Atlantic Star approached Savannah Harbor, running smoothly on its repaired engine, Sarah stood in the engine room with her notebook, already planning her next challenge. She had proven herself in the most dramatic way possible, but she knew that this was just the beginning of her career as a marine engineer. The young woman, who had started as a junior mechanic, was about to become one of the most sought-after engine diagnosticians in the maritime industry. Her reputation for solving impossible problems was about to spread far beyond the confines of a single ship. The news of Sarah's remarkable engine repair spread through the maritime industry faster than anyone could have imagined. Within days of the MV Atlantic Star's arrival in Savannah, Sarah found herself at the center of a media storm that would change her life forever. The first call came from the local maritime newspaper, followed quickly by industry magazines and then major news outlets. Everyone wanted to know more about the young woman who had solved a problem that 3 certified engineers had declared impossible. Sarah was uncomfortable with the attention at first, preferring to focus on her work rather than publicity, but she soon realized that the coverage was opening doors she had never dreamed possible. Captain Morrison had immediately filed a detailed report with the shipping company, documenting not only Sarah's successful repair, but also the thoroughness of her diagnostic work and the innovative approaches she had used. The company's executives were initially skeptical. How could a junior mechanic succeed where experienced engineers had failed? But the evidence was undeniable. The engine was running better than it had in years, and the repair had saved them millions of dollars. 3 weeks after the repair, Sarah received an unexpected visitor while the ship was docked in Baltimore. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, a professor of marine engineering at the prestigious Maritime Academy, had come to meet the young woman whose work had captured the attention of the entire industry. "Sarah," Dr. Chen said as they stood in the engine room of the Atlantic Star, "I've been teaching marine engineering for 20 years, and I've never seen diagnostic work as thorough as what you've documented in this notebook." Sarah felt honored but also nervous. Dr. Chen was one of the most respected authorities in marine engineering, and her textbooks were used in maritime academies around the world. "Professor Chen," Sarah said, "I was just doing what seemed logical. The engine was trying to tell us what was wrong. I just had to listen carefully enough to understand what it was saying." Dr. Chen smiled. "That kind of intuitive understanding combined with rigorous technical analysis is exactly what the industry needs. Sarah, have you ever considered pursuing formal engineering credentials?" Sarah had thought about it many times, but the obstacles had always seemed insurmountable. "I'd love to, Professor, but I can't afford to stop working to attend school full-time. And I don't have the academic background for most engineering programs." "What if I told you there might be another way?" Dr. Chen asked. "Based on your demonstrated expertise, I believe you could qualify for an accelerated program designed for working professionals with exceptional practical experience. The Maritime Academy has a special track for individuals who have proven their abilities in real-world situations. The possibility of earning formal engineering credentials while continuing to work was something Sarah had never imagined could be possible." Dr. Chen explained that the program would be demanding, requiring intensive study and rigorous examinations, but it would recognize her practical experience and allow her to earn a degree in just 2 years. Meanwhile, job offers began pouring in from shipping companies around the world. The industry was facing a shortage of skilled marine engineers, and Sarah's proven ability to solve complex problems made her incredibly valuable. Companies offered her positions with salaries that were double or triple what she was currently earning. Frank Rodriguez watched these developments with mixed feelings. He was proud of Sarah's success, but he was also worried about losing the best mechanic he had ever worked with. The MV Atlantic Star's engine continued to run flawlessly, and Sarah's reputation was attracting positive attention to their entire engineering team. "Sarah," Frank said one day as they performed routine maintenance, "I know you're going to leave us soon. These job offers are too good to turn down, but I want you to know that working with you has been the highlight of my career." Sarah looked up from the engine component she was inspecting. "Frank, I haven't made any decisions yet. This ship has been my home for 2 years. The crew here gave me a chance when nobody else would." But Sarah knew that Frank was right. The opportunities opening up for her were extraordinary, and she would be foolish not to consider them seriously. Several major shipping companies had offered her positions as their chief troubleshooter, traveling around the world to solve their most challenging engine problems. The most intriguing offer came from Maritime Solutions International, a consulting firm that specialized in solving impossible engineering problems for the shipping industry. They wanted Sarah to lead a new division focused on advanced engine diagnostics, with a team of engineers working under her direction. "Think about it, Sarah," said Robert Hayes, MSI's president, during a video call. "You would have access to the most advanced diagnostic equipment available, a team of the best engineers in the industry, and the opportunity to work on the most challenging problems from around the world. Plus, we would support your education goals, including paying for your engineering degree." The offer was tempting, but Sarah wanted to complete at least one more voyage on the Atlantic Star before making any major career decisions. She felt a loyalty to Captain Morrison and the crew who had supported her during her most challenging moment. During the ship's next voyage, from Baltimore to Liverpool, Sarah found herself thinking constantly about her future. The successful engine repair had changed everything for her, but it had also created new pressures and expectations. Everyone now looked at her as the miracle worker who could solve any problem, and she wasn't sure she was ready for that level of responsibility. The turning point came during a chance encounter with Maria Santos, an experienced marine engineer who was traveling as a passenger on the Atlantic Star. Maria had heard about Sarah's reputation and sought her out to discuss the challenges facing women in the maritime industry. "Sarah," Maria said as they walked on the ship's deck. 20 years ago, when I started in this industry, women like us had to work twice as hard to get half the recognition. You've accomplished something remarkable, not just for yourself, but for every woman who wants to work in marine engineering. Maria went on to explain that she had spent her career working for others, always having to prove herself, always fighting to be taken seriously. You have an opportunity that most of us never get, she said. You have the chance to set your own terms, to choose your own path. Don't waste it by playing it safe. Sarah spent many hours over the next few days thinking about Maria's words. She realized that her success with the engine repair had given her something more valuable than money or job security. It had given her credibility and options. She could choose to stay in her comfort zone, or she could use her newfound reputation to push the boundaries of what was possible in her field. The decision became clear when Sarah received a call from Dr. Chen with unexpected news. The Maritime Academy had reviewed Sarah's case and her documented repair work, and they were prepared to offer her something unprecedented: full recognition of her practical experience toward an engineering degree, plus a research fellowship that would allow her to develop new diagnostic techniques. Sarah, Dr. Chen explained, we want you to help us revolutionize how marine engineers are trained. Your approach to engine diagnosis, the combination of intuitive listening and rigorous documentation, is exactly what we need to teach the next generation of engineers. But the most compelling aspect of the offer was the opportunity to work on real-world problems while pursuing her degree. The Maritime Academy had partnerships with shipping companies around the world, and Sarah would be able to travel to solve complex engineering problems while conducting research for her thesis. When Sarah shared this news with Captain Morrison, he was not surprised by her decision to accept the offer. Sarah, he said, you've already outgrown this ship. We've all known that since the day you fixed that engine. You belong in a place where you can use your talents to their fullest potential. Frank Rodriguez was more emotional about Sarah's departure. Promise me you'll remember where you came from, he said as they worked together one last time in the engine room. Don't let all the success change who you are. Sarah's last night aboard the MV Atlantic Star was bittersweet. She stood in the engine room, listening to the smooth, powerful sound of the engine she had repaired. The vibrations that had once told her something was wrong now spoke of perfect mechanical harmony. She had learned to listen to this engine's language, and in doing so, she had discovered her own voice as an engineer. The crew threw a farewell party for Sarah, and even some of the passengers attended. Captain Morrison presented her with a special commendation from the shipping company, recognizing her outstanding service and technical achievement. But the gift that meant the most to Sarah was a framed photograph of the engine room, signed by every member of the engineering crew. As the Atlantic Star prepared to dock in Liverpool, Sarah packed her belongings, including the notebook that had documented her journey from doubt to confidence. The pages that had once recorded her uncertainty and observations now represented a complete transformation, from a junior mechanic who was dismissed by experts to a recognized authority in marine engineering. 5 years later, Sarah Martinez stood before an audience of 300 marine engineers at the International Maritime Engineering Conference in Singapore. Her presentation, titled Revolutionary Approaches to Engine Diagnostics, was the keynote address of the conference, and the auditorium was packed with industry leaders from around the world. The woman on stage bore little resemblance to the uncertain junior mechanic who had once been dismissed by certified engineers. Sarah now held a doctorate in marine engineering, had published dozens of research papers, and had developed diagnostic techniques that were being used by shipping companies worldwide. But despite all her success, she had never forgotten the lessons she learned in the engine room of the MV Atlantic Star. 5 years ago, Sarah began her presentation. I was a junior mechanic on a cargo ship, trying to convince 3 certified engineers that they had misdiagnosed an engine problem. They dismissed my observations because I lacked formal credentials. Today I want to talk about why listening to machinery is just as important as understanding theory. The audience was captivated as Sarah described her journey from that first successful repair to her current position as director of the Advanced Marine Diagnostics Institute. She had assembled a team of engineers, technicians, and researchers who were revolutionizing how the maritime industry approached mechanical problems. The institute had developed portable diagnostic equipment that could analyze engine problems with unprecedented accuracy. But more importantly, they had created training programs that taught engineers to combine traditional analytical methods with the intuitive approaches that Sarah had pioneered. We've discovered that the most effective diagnosticians aren't necessarily those with the most formal education, Sarah explained to the conference audience. They're the people who have learned to listen to what machinery is trying to communicate through sounds, vibrations, and performance patterns. In the 5 years since leaving the Atlantic Star, Sarah had consulted on hundreds of engine problems around the world. Her success rate was remarkable. She had solved problems that other experts had declared unsolvable in over 90% of the cases she had taken on. One of her most famous cases involved a luxury cruise ship whose engines had been plaguing the vessel for months. Multiple engineering firms had attempted repairs, spending millions of dollars replacing major components, but the problems persisted. Sarah's team identified the root cause as a software glitch in the computerized engine management system, something that traditional diagnostic approaches had completely missed. Another breakthrough case involved a fleet of container ships that were experiencing premature engine failures. Traditional analysis suggested manufacturing defects or poor maintenance, but Sarah's investigation revealed that the problems were caused by a specific type of fuel additive that was interacting badly with the engine's fuel injection system. Her findings led to changes in fuel specifications that saved the shipping industry hundreds of millions of dollars. Advanced Marine Diagnostics Institute had become the go-to resource for shipping companies facing complex technical problems. Sarah's team included former ship mechanics like herself, experienced engineers, computer specialists, and material scientists. The diversity of backgrounds and approaches had proven to be one of their greatest strengths, but Sarah's influence extended far beyond problem-solving. She had become a powerful advocate for recognizing practical experience and intuitive insights in engineering education. The Maritime Academy had completely revised its curriculum based on her research, incorporating hands-on diagnostic training and emphasizing the importance of listening to machinery. We used to teach students that engineering was purely analytical, Dr. Chen, now a close colleague and research partner, often said. Sarah showed us that the best engineers combine analytical thinking with intuitive understanding. They don't just calculate what should be happening, they pay attention to what is actually happening. Sarah's work had also had a significant impact on gender equality in the maritime industry. Her success had inspired countless young women to pursue careers in marine engineering, and she had established scholarship programs to support female students who might otherwise lack the resources to attend engineering school. During her conference presentation, Sarah shared a slide showing statistics about women in maritime engineering. When she had started her career 7 years earlier, less than 5% of marine engineers were women. That number had now grown to nearly 15%, and Sarah's institute employed an engineering staff that was 40% female. Diversity isn't just about fairness, Sarah told the conference audience. It's about bringing different perspectives to complex problems. Some of our most innovative solutions have come from engineers who approached problems in ways that traditional thinking would never have considered. After her presentation, Sarah was surrounded by engineers eager to learn more about her diagnostic techniques. She spent hours answering questions and discussing specific cases, but the conversation that meant the most to her came from an unexpected source. "Excuse me, Dr. Martinez," said a young woman in work clothes rather than the business attire worn by most conference attendees. "I'm Maria Rodriguez, and I'm a junior mechanic on a container ship. I've been following your work, and I wanted to thank you for showing people like me that we can make a difference." Sarah smiled, remembering her own younger self. "Maria, what kind of problems are you working on?" "We have an engine that's been making strange noises for weeks," Maria explained. "The senior engineers think it's normal wear and tear, but something doesn't feel right to me. I've been documenting the sounds and vibration patterns just like you did on the Atlantic Star." Sarah was impressed by Maria's initiative. "Have you shared your observations with the senior staff?" "I tried, but they told me I don't have enough experience to question their diagnosis," Maria said, her frustration evident. Sarah handed Maria her business card. "Send me your documentation. If you're right about the problem, I want to help you prove it. And if you're interested in pursuing engineering education, my institute has scholarship programs specifically for people with your kind of hands-on experience." This conversation reminded Sarah why her work was so important. There were countless talented people working in the maritime industry, whose insights were being overlooked because they lacked formal credentials. Her mission was to change that, to create a culture where good ideas were valued regardless of their source. As the conference ended, Sarah reflected on how far she had traveled from that day when she first approached Captain Morrison with her theory about the fuel injection pump. The scared young woman who had risked her career to prove a point had become a respected leader who was changing an entire industry. But the most satisfying aspect of her success wasn't the recognition or the financial rewards. It was the knowledge that her work was making a real difference. Ships around the world were running more efficiently because of the diagnostic techniques her team had developed. Young engineers were being trained to listen as well as analyze. And people like Maria Rodriguez were finding opportunities that might not have existed a few years earlier. Sarah's phone buzzed with a message from Frank Rodriguez, her former supervisor on the Atlantic Star. It was a picture of the engine room with a simple caption, "Still running perfectly." "Thanks again." She smiled as she looked at the photo. That engine, the one that 3 experts had declared beyond repair, was still powering the MV Atlantic Star across the world's oceans. It served as a daily reminder that sometimes the impossible is just waiting for someone brave enough to listen carefully and trust their own expertise. As Sarah packed up her presentation materials and prepared to return to her institute, she thought about the future of marine engineering. Technology was advancing rapidly, with computerized systems and artificial intelligence becoming increasingly important. But she was convinced that human intuition and careful observation would always be essential elements of good engineering. Her next project involved developing training programs that would teach artificial intelligence systems to recognize the subtle patterns that experienced engineers could detect by sound and feel. It was an ambitious goal, but Sarah had learned long ago that the most worthwhile challenges were often the ones that seemed impossible at first. The young woman who had once been told she was just a junior mechanic had become living proof that expertise comes in many forms, and that sometimes the most important discoveries are made by people who are brave enough to trust their own observations, even when the experts disagree.